The contract. Once you find your home, we've gone through, we've viewed, we've narrowed them down. We're like, yes, we've looked at the seller's disclosure. We've looked at the neighborhood. This is the house we want. We're in love. We want it. Okay. Let's go over what the contract looks like. So ahead of time during this buyer's 101 process, so that you have an idea and the buyer has an idea of the contract prior to submitting an offer. Because for most of our buyers, this purchase process is one of the biggest, hugest financial decisions of their entire life. So let's go over what a contract looks like. Sample contract. So here's a sample contract. We're going to go over the seller's name and confirm how they want it to appear on the contract. Take this time to write that down and make a note of that. All right. This is the property description. I also love to go over improvements before looking at houses. So if we go over the contract with a buyer before they even look at the house, they'll understand that that light fixture comes with the property, anything that's permanently attached. So I like to think of it, if you take this house, you turn it around, you shake it, and you dump it out the front door, everything else that stays remains with the property. Okay. One of the biggest discussions for a long time is TVs. So what you'll see is it's mounts and brackets for televisions, but not the television. I still like to put it in exclusions if it's not coming with the property, so there's no confusion, just because that seems to be a big deal. The other thing I like to talk about is shrubbery and landscaping. If we're looking at a property and there's some kind of landscaping, like a landscaping rock or accessory, or maybe a decorative swing set or a bird bath, I like to have that conversation with the listing agent ahead of time. Accessories, all the accessories that come with the property. I also like to have that conversation with the listing agent, but also I like to have that conversation now so that we know when we look at the property. Exclusions are usually listed on the MLS, but we all know, us listing agents, sometimes we get busy, we don't know, we haven't gone through this whole process. Have that conversation with the listing agent if this is the house we want to put an offer on, so that we're not having to come back later before closing or during the walkthrough and be like, hey, where's that bird bath that was in the front yard? Or where's that chandelier? The other thing that we need to do is make sure that we print out, if this is the offer we're putting down, make sure we print out the entire MLS sheet and all the photos ahead of time, so that if for some reason during the walkthrough something has changed, we know from this is the date we looked at the property, this is the way it looked, this is what we're expecting when we purchase the property. Okay. The inspection report is really helpful with that too. So sales price, this is the cash. So our lender, when during that consultation on the pre-approval, it's going to say, hey, they qualify for a 5% loan, 10%, 3.5%, 0%. That's the cash portion we're going to put down here. And then we're going to put the financing portion here. So let's say, for easy math, $500,000 offer, 10% down, $50,000 cash, $450,000 financing. The total of that is going to be $500,000. Okay. Understand that that $50,000 is cash for the offer, for the sales price of your home. There are other fees that can be included on that as well. All right. And we're going to go into that here in a second. If this property is for lease, we're going to need to check off that there is a residential lease that accompanies this. And we're going to add this as an addenda. Earnest money and option money. Remember how I said earlier that there's a lot of money that buyers submit before they even get to the closing table? Here's an example. Earnest money, it's typically about 1%. Okay. The sellers would like to see more. Buyers typically would like to see less. What we're typically seeing is 1%. If we're competing, we can go as high as 2% or even higher, as high as the buyer's willing to go. Option money, option fee. The option fee is actually the money that the buyer gives to the seller. It's non-refundable, but can get applied towards the cash portion of their purchase. So let's say $250 to $500 option fee. And what you're doing is you're purchasing the option to get out of the contract for any reason for this period of time in paragraph 5B. So in here it says 7 days. So we're seeing 5 days, 7 days. Sellers usually want less days because they want to know that they're under contract. Buyers need to have enough time in there for them to do their due diligence, meaning they get their inspections out there. They drive around the neighborhood at night, make sure it's the neighborhood they want. They get everybody's approval. They bring the whole family. During this period of time, this is a period of time you're going to do your entire due diligence. Okay. You get the inspector in there and the inspector says, oh, I recommend you have the roof looked at, the AC looked at, the foundation looked at. You're going to get all your people in there to look at it. The inspection is another check you're going to cut. Let's say roughly $500, depending on the size of the property, right? A lot of times roof might charge an inspection fee, typically not. HVAC typically will charge an additional inspection fee. Foundation companies sometimes will charge an inspection fee. Engineers report for sure will charge inspection fees. So there's a lot of extra monies that can come out of pocket. So just be prepared ahead of time. I don't want anybody to get in here and be so tight that they can't afford to do their due diligence during the due diligence period. The earnest money and the option money is typically sent to the title company. You'll notice that there's a lot of blanks in here. All of this is negotiable. Right now we're using Capital Title, Terry Ralph, and that auto populates in our system. We've had a relationship with her. She's been doing this for golly 20 years. She knows the ins and outs of title. So she's part of our team, and like so many others, there's tons of amazing title companies out there. She's not the only one, but we like working with her. There is a time frame on this. So be prepared that once you're under contract, you have 3 days after the effective date of the contract. And we're going to talk about the effective date. Another name for effective date can be executed date, the date that this is executed. Don't screw this up. Send that money in. All right. Title policy and survey. If you have a loan, you're required to have a title policy. That's insurance that the title is correct and that there's no heirs or anybody else that says this property belongs to me. Okay, that's what that insurance is for. The title company is going to go through, do an entire title search, make sure there's no liens, that the property is conveyed to the buyer free and clear. It can be seller's expense, buyer's expense. We have seen it checked both. Essentially, that means they're splitting the cost. Okay. And then there's also survey coverage. Essentially, that's what this is survey coverage. Shortages in the area. So let's say the property's, listed at 1 acre. We think we're buying 1 acre, but the survey's off and it's actually less. Who's going to purchase that? It's not mandatory that you check this off. If you're buying a cash property, it's not mandatory that you have title policy or survey coverage or a survey at that, but we always recommend it, of course. Here's survey. So this is something that gets confused. So typically in our contracts, we say that the survey is going to be provided by the seller within blank days. Typically it's 3 days. If it's on the MLS, so if we're a listing agent, it's on the MLS, that's really technically not considered delivery. Delivery is in the inbox, in the email to the cooperating agent. So if we get it in our inbox and we share it with the buyer, and it's got to be the affidavit and the survey. There's an affidavit that the seller has to go get notarized. And it doesn't have to be both sellers if it's a Mr. and Mrs. Just one seller has to get it notarized. And that affidavit accompanies this survey. And it basically says, yes, there has been changes. There's not aware of any changes. If the pool's been put in, fences have been moved, a lot of cement work has been done. Those are changes on a survey that the lender or the title company may require a buyer to get a new survey. If for any reason, let's say the affidavit wasn't accompanied, who is going to pay for the new survey? We check that box here, seller or buyer. More often than not, we see that, and it depends on the market. If you're competing and the buyer might say, hey, I'll pay for it. The other option here is that the buyer will pay for a new one or the seller will pay for a new one. Okay. Objections. Let's say you're buying a property and you want to put in a daycare. He says, hey, I need to be able to put a small business here. I need to be able to put trucks here. We have seen this say residential use. That's redundant because this is obviously a residential contract. You don't have to put residential use in here. And it says after so many days, after receiving the commitment exception documents and the survey, the buyer has that period of time to ensure that we can put dump trucks there. We can run a daycare out of there. We can put a pool in the backyard, something like that. Okay. That's usually what we see there. Membership in Property Owners Association. That's another way of saying HOA or homeowners association. If it is or is not in a homeowners association. If it is a part of a homeowners association, TREC has an additional form promulgated that we fill out, and we'll get to that too. Okay. Tidewaters, you'll notice that there's verbiage in here for the entire state of Texas. North Texas does not have Tidewater, so it doesn't apply, but all of this on how to deal with that, if it comes to be an issue, we can reference this contract. Now, this contract used to be one page, as you can tell. There's been things that have come up, and over the years, it has gotten longer and longer and longer. So let's talk about property condition. One of the big things and very important is that in here it says that the sellers will have the utilities on so that the buyers can do inspections and have access to the property. This is outlined right here in paragraph A. Seller at seller's expense shall immediately cause existing utilities to be turned on and shall keep the utilities on during the time this contract is in effect. Now, I don't know how there has been times where we've had sellers that didn't do that. The buyers have the option to terminate because they can't get an inspection if they cannot get the sellers to do that. All right. We've seen buyers before turn on utilities, but that's super risky. So just be aware, water and gas, like if something happens, it's a liability for us buyers. I'm not an attorney and I'm not giving legal advice. So this is where we ask them to do that. Seller's disclosure, typically listing agents are going to put it on the MLS and we can give it to the buyers ahead of time. If for some reason we do not have access to the seller's disclosure ahead of time, we're going to say, hey, please give that to us like in the next 1 to 2 days prior to inspection, right? I like getting the seller's disclosure before we put down non-refundable option money of $500 if possible. It's not always possible. And at the end of the day, it's at the buyer's discretion on what they want to do. If we're competing, then there's that. Acceptance of property condition. Now, this is where buyers can get a little confused between as is and accept as. So you'll notice that it's as is, but it doesn't mean that a buyer cannot do an inspection and negotiate repairs during the option period. So as is, so we're going to check as is, but let's say a buyer walks into a room and they're like, I want this, but I need this offer of $500,000 is contingent on the seller staining the fence in the backyard. That's going to be the treatment, and we'll put that here. Buyer accept the property as is, provided seller at seller's expense shall complete the following specific repairs and treatments, and we'll put that here. It might be replace the carpet in the office. It might be painting the entire house a specific color. Okay, if it's in here, I would make it as specific as possible, or at least come back in the option period and be very specific. Okay, especially if it's painting the house. You don't want them to repaint the house red. And you don't want them to use their neighbor's 12-year-old daughter to paint the house. You see my Ava painting a house in there. That won't look good, right? So just be as specific as you can. In here also says if there's lender required repairs, the seller, how that works out, as well as other things. Broker fees are in a separate agreement. We talked about that, buyer's rep agreement and listing agreement with the seller. Closing date. So all dates. So you notice at the very beginning, we said that earnest monies and option monies are due within, let's say, 3 days of executed date. And then we have our closing date. So that's going to be a different date. So closing is a day that we're going to close, where everybody is going to sign off. We have had where, let's say we close on Thursday, but it didn't fund till Friday, but everybody needs to close on Thursday. Possession. So there's two possessions. You can have possession where the buyer can walk in, get the key, and start moving in on closing. That's upon closing and funding. So remember, if you close on Thursday and doesn't fund till Friday, you do not get possession till Friday. I also like to let buyers know, please don't plan on having your moving truck in on closing day or Friday. Like, if you're closing and funding on Friday, if at all possible, get the moving truck to come in on Monday. I promise you, a seller's idea of move-in ready clean is not going to be the same as a buyer's. You're going to want to go in and probably like put in shelf paper, or replace shelf paper, or do that deep clean, or do things, or just a few little things in the house before the big moving day comes. All right, give yourself like a little bit of time to just change out the air filters, do something. And I'm going to let you know right now, if you do not put that shelf liner in before you put in those cups, the chances of you coming back in and ever putting shelf liner in that house again is almost slim to none. So give yourself that time to do that before you start unpacking the whole house. Now, the other option on possession is according to a temporary residential leaseback. Again, that's a promulgated form by TREC, and it says in here, and it's an additional addendum that we can add. So a lot of times when buyers are negotiating, the sellers are going to ask for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a leaseback, a period of time that the seller can live in the house after the property closes. Now, on that seller's temporary leaseback, it can be free to the sellers. It can be, we can ask the sellers to reimburse the buyers PITI, which is principal, interest, taxes, and insurance. The title company will figure out exactly what that is and collect that from the sellers at closing. It'll be taken out of what's given to the sellers, and it'll be given to the buyer as a credit to their cash to close. So all that'll be done right at closing and you'll see how that's outlined. So just be aware, again, please don't make your moving truck the day of possession. Now, utilities need to be turned on possession day, not closing day, but possession day. I love using this contract and going over it to kind of go over all those little deals. Settlement and other expenses. So this is where the sellers can contribute cash to close, and the lender will let you know exactly how much the lender will allow the sellers to contribute. This is a good opportunity for buyers to get a little extra money. A lot of times, if it is a seller's market, buyers are not going to ask the sellers for any monies, because if you put in a $500,000 offer and then you ask the seller to contribute $5,000 towards your closing costs, you've got to understand that your offer is being looked at as an offer of $495,000, not $500,000, but a $495,000. So the other time this paragraph comes into play, a lot of times what I see is during the inspection period. Let's say there's some repairs that you're seeing that comes up. Let's say the HVAC is something, and maybe like the water heater is, something. And instead of asking the seller to make those repairs, we'll take it on, because we know we want a tankless water heater. We don't want them to replace it with the same thing, and whatever it is. And we've negotiated, let's say $5,000 in lieu of repairs. We can put that here. Again, that'll be applied towards cash to closing, so that at the end of the day, the buyer has more cash to make those repairs. Prorations. So you have things like, let's say, taxes, HOA fees, all those prorated expenses will be handled by the title company. They will figure all that out, and it'll get credited or debited as needed to the buyers and sellers. It's not done outside. Casualty loss, we see this like sometimes during hail season, tornado season, something you put in an offer and then hailstorm comes through, totals the roof. Okay, this outlines how that's going to happen. All right, and it extends the time performance, and the closing date can be extended as necessary. If for some reason the sellers can't do it, it outlines how that's going to happen. Default, mediation, you're familiar with these clauses. It was similar to the others. Escrows, if for some reason this contract doesn't go through, it outlines how the escrow monies, remember that was that 1% earnest money that was held in escrow, how that gets handled, or other things. Representation, you are who you are. Federal tax requirement, if you're a foreign person, this paragraph applies more to foreigners. Agreement of parties. So these are all the other addendums that can be added to this contract. And there's a whole lot more, right? And you'll notice there's a lot of banks. The ones that I'm going to say that we use the most are going to be in the top right-hand corner, the seller's temporary residential lease. And that determines possession, and it outlines all those little deals. We're not using the short sale addendum as much right now. Most people have a lot of equity in their homes. The other one that we're seeing a lot of is going to be the third party financing addendum. In the top left, that's always checked, typically, unless it's a cash deal. When they say third party financing, that means that the buyer is not supplying their own cash. There is somebody else giving the buyer cash for the property. There's a third party involved. There's a backup. We have a backup addendum. And then the other big one, the HOA addendum, which is the mandatory membership in a property owners association. And then there's also the one that's not listed here. It's the appraisal clause. So sometimes buyers, if they're competing, they're going to want to put in more than what appraised value. There's an addendum for that. It's new. And then also, if the house is built before 1978, there's a lead-based paint addendum. And those are probably used the most. On this page, right here, is the executed contract date. That is the date that you're going to put your executed contract. You do not put that date on. That is not the date where the offer was submitted or the seller viewed. Let's say you make any changes in the contract. If there's one change made on this contract, both people have to initial it. Both parties, both the buyer party and the selling party, have to initial off before you can execute. The execution date is the date that all the terms, every blank and every check mark and everything in that contract has been agreed upon by both the buyers and the sellers. Now, sellers need to understand, once they agree to this, this is binding, okay? They're not coming back to change their mind on any of it later. Buyers, on the other hand, have an option period in which they purchased in order to get out of the contract or renegotiate for any reason. If there is a third-party financing addendum, that's another out in the contract. There's multiple outs in the contract for the buyers. Sellers, on the other hand, unless you cannot give a clear title, it's going to be tough. And I'm not trying to give legal advice, so I'm just letting you know that these are the situations that we can find ourselves into. So sellers need to make sure that they are wanting this. Buyers just know. Okay, so now we've made the offer, we've sent it off to the listing agent. The seller can do one of three things. They can accept the offer, reject the offer, or counter the offer. Typically what we're going to see is they either accept, typically it's going to be they're going to counter. Now, the times that they reject the offer is if it's like a real lowball offer. We see those with investors. So one of those three things can happen. At that point, it's so critical that your agent knows you and what's important to you, right? Because when they have that conversation, when us as buyer's agents have that conversation with the listing agent, we're looking for what's important to the seller. Because sometimes for the buyer, what's important to the buyer is that they're coming to closing with as little money out of pocket as possible. But what's important to the seller is that they don't have to move out of the house right away when it closes. They really need a 3-week lease back. And if that's something that the buyer can offer and the seller can receive, we can sometimes offer less money, or maybe seller's contributions to closing, or maybe we can have the sellers pay a lease back, right? To add more cash to close. So as a buyer's agent, built that relationship, ask a lot of questions, and really gotten to know our buyers, we can really negotiate really well for our buyers because we know what they need. And then we talk to the listing agent and we ask the listing agent what the sellers really need. And we make a win-win negotiation, right? Now, some people are like, you got to hammer the seller at the very beginning. Well, the problem with that is that we're actually in a 30-day relationship, right? 30-day relationship. What we've seen is sellers that love their buyers are more willing to help a buyer out. There's been times where a buyer at the very end, something has come up and they need the seller's help. It's important that we have a good working relationship with the seller so that the buyer doesn't get bit in the katush at the very end, right? And vice versa. That relationship is so critical to have a smooth move and a smooth transaction past closing.